r/NuclearRevenge. Town forced to bulldoze new development after building on land they don't own. I read it. I've got one gem of a story that my grandfather told me about his hometown after he came home from World War II. It has to do with a tree farmer, a corrupt mayor, and over 20 homes getting bulldozed. Enjoy. At the end of World War II, thousands of troops were heading home, starting new families, and wanting to move out of the city. There was a major housing boom all around the country. People couldn't move out of the cities fast enough, and developers could not build homes fast enough. There was a ton of money to be made in the construction business, which led to some underhanded building practices. One such practice was starting construction before the land acquisition was finalized. Enter my grandfather, let's call him G. After serving as a pilot during the war, he came home to a very different town. When my G went off to fight in 1942, the town that he described leaving was tired and worn down. But to his amazement, the town he saw stepping off the train in 1948 was anything but. Newly paved roads, a traffic light, and new homes. New homes that just went on and on. He actually got lost on his way back to the family farm due to the new main town road being rerouted while he was away. But what took him by surprise the most was the new development being built on his childhood friend John's tree farm. This was surprising to him mainly because he knew how much the farm meant to John and his family. The farm went back at least 2 generations, but my G just guessed that the developer made John's family an offer too good to refuse. However, that thought was shot down later that evening during his welcome home dinner back home. It was my great-grandmother who tipped him off that something was off. He couldn't recall exactly what she said, but it was something along the lines of, "Oh, I just wish John was still alive to be here." My G nearly choked, not because of the news, but because John was not dead. He was still in Hawaii. My G had gotten a postcard from him not 4 days before. Turns out, while John was off in the Navy fighting in the Pacific Theater, John's dad had suffered a stroke and passed away. His mother passed away less than a week later from a quote-unquote broken heart. More than likely, John was never informed of their passing, and now 20-plus homes were being built on their land. My G almost ran out of the house, jumped in his father's Model T, and raced down into town to send one bombshell of a telegraph to John in Hawaii. "John, your folks passed, farm now being built on, come quick, G." My G never got a response back. He figures that John must have fainted from shock, then jumped up and ran to the Navy base to get on the first boat home because he was back home in less than 4 days, and he was mad. According to my G, when he burst through the doors of the mayor's office, everyone in the room looked like they were about to drop dead. The poor desk clerk was fumbling over his words, trying to talk to John. Then the mayor came out of his office to see what all the commotion was about. As soon as he saw John, he went white as a sheet and then ran back into his office and locked the door. Getting nowhere at the mayor's office, John went to the next town over and hired a lawyer. What followed was a 7-year court case that ended in the mayor being sentenced to 8 years in jail and the developer going bankrupt. Turns out that after John's parents passed away, John wasn't able to be contacted for some reason and was just assumed dead. So when an out-of-state developer wanted to build homes in the area, the mayor just permitted them to start building on John's farm for a hefty kickback, of course. Also, because of John's lawsuit, the developer couldn't finish the pre-sold homes, which ended up in more lawsuits. In the end, the mayor, the developer, and the town ended up having to pay John close to $45,000 total, which is over $752 million today.
Ooh, something came in the mail today. I wonder what it is. It's Rufus rugs!
Got him!
Now, hopefully after this ad plays, you two can say you got him! A rug from Rufus Rugs. Now me and the boys have been grinding non-stop 24/7, making one-of-one hand-tufted premium rugs. Now there's a chance you own a carpet that looks something like this. Let's just be real, it's time for an upgrade. And luckily for you, me and the boys from Rufus Rugs are at your service. We don't make those average cheap quality looking rugs. Nope, not gonna happen. Each one is handcrafted to perfection. No shortcuts, no robot assembly lines, and no dropshipping BS. Just pure rug grind. Whether you love anime, sports, cars, or anything else you can think of, we can turn it into a rug. So click the first link in the description and have your custom idea come to life.
and then the farm had to be returned to its prior condition. To say John was happy would be a vast understatement. Today, John's tree farm is a nature reserve, and the story of the corrupted mayor is all but forgotten except for a few locals. John passed away in 1999. My G has been back to his hometown a few times to visit his grave and to check on the old tree farm. Hearing about that story made me feel like I journeyed through the archives of small-town history that's filled with tales of corruption and moral retribution. It can definitely give any reimagined Hollywood film noir a run for its money. I mean, we have a post-war era backdrop, a time when people are optimistic for a new future, and every citizen is holding on to the promise of the American dream of white picket fences. And then comes our hero, fresh from battle. He comes home only to wonder if he has entered some kind of wormhole into a new dimension. Paved roads, modern traffic lights, and rows upon rows of new homes that he almost lost his way. If that were me, of course I'd feel ecstatic seeing bright new stuff, but man, I could use a little heads up and probably maps of the city posted on every available surface. I mean, is this the thanks I would be getting for fighting off baddies in the war? Getting lost in my own city? No thanks, man. I was thinking more in the lines of a welcome home parade overflowing booze with all the bells and whistles. Anyway, it's a good thing he was able to get home to his still intact family farm, which is more than I could say for his best buddy, the unsung hero of this story, John. For one, the poor guy is already toughing it out at war, clueless of the family tragedy that occurred, and then some corrupt official teams up with scrupulous developers to splice and dice his beloved farm. And the icing on the cake, he was written off as dead because nobody could get a hold of him. Come on, people. His parents passed away. Who else would try to contact him? They probably didn't even try. Of course, the allure of making a hefty kickback would have been too hard for the mayor to resist. Luckily, when our hero, G, takes a whiff of the foul smell of injustice and deceit, he swooped right in and took action, and not another minute too late at that. And when John came back within 4 days, I was thinking, wow, being in the army sure has its perks. I mean, the guy was in Hawaii, and correct me if I'm wrong, but air travel wasn't as fast then as it is now. Plus, travel by train would probably take a day or two at best. Anyway, fast forward to the courtroom drama, and 7 years of legal battle is no joke, but eventually wrongs are righted and the villains face their reckoning. And let's not forget the piece de resistance, that eye-popping sum of $45,000. Who knew that trees could be worth their weight in gold? So, cheers to you, John, and may your legacy grow taller than your trees. Story 2. My parents divorced when I was in first grade. Not only did my dad disappear like Houdini, he stole my mother's ATM card to her personal account and drained her dry. My mother, being the saint that she is, didn't even bat an eye. She was still cordial to him and never said a negative word about him. To me, my dad, albeit abandoning us, was still my hero. From 1st through 5th grade, I had the usual abandoned by dad stories. Maybe 1 or 2 visits in a year, and about 50 times of me waiting by the front window with my suitcase packed to go to his house, and him never showing up. My mom, through all of this, was supportive and never said an ill word about him, so he still stayed my hero. When I was in 6th grade, my mother finally remarried, and my father, who only had a picture of me at 8 months old in his wallet, went ballistic. Did I mention that he never paid child support? He would use his father's social, they had the same name, to get away with it. After my mom remarried, he let it be known that I was now my stepdad's responsibility. He cut off communication with me until I graduated from high school. He didn't attend my graduation or send a card. What he did do was write me an email thanking God he no longer had to pay child support. He did it anyway. What really broke me was his ruthless and brutal attack on my mother, attacking her weight, looks, teeth, and blaming any perceived negative traits that I had on her. For the first time, I realized what a cowardly man he was. I responded in kind. He told me I was no child of his and that I was a waste. After that, I vowed that I would hurt him. 10 years later, my father, not interested in my wedding or my son, reached out to me. You see, he is a diabetic and one of his organs was failing and he didn't have too long. He's too far down on the list and he needed someone in our family to donate. NuclearRevenge activated. I answered his email, I met up with him, and pretended that I didn't hate his guts. I went and got tested to see if I was a match. I was, did the therapy, and met with doctors and his therapist. We scheduled the surgery. The day of the surgery, we met at the hospital. I smiled to his face and let him know that I wouldn't be going through with the surgery. I watched the confusion line on his face. I just wanted you to know that you're no father to me and you're a waste. I left the hospital and drove home. My mom was pretty annoyed with me for taking it that far. My father is dying and I will be attending the funeral out of spite. I will let everyone know what a worthless man he was. So, why do I feel this way about him? My father was semi-obsessed with my mother. His attachment to us was only in his perceived ability to get back with my mother. In the beginning, he would call and make plans to see us and just not show up. My mom would have to make up excuses, and he has been married more than 4 times and supports and loves his other kids without a thought to us. Once my mother remarried, he was done with us. He kept in contact with my mother through email but had no interest in talking to his children. I have reached out to him before to invite him to my graduation, to let him know of my marriage and that he was a grandfather. All I got back was pictures of his new wife's kiddos. Upon getting to know him after agreeing to donate, I went to one of his therapy sessions at his request. There, I heard the story of the true reason he contacted me. I listened as he lamented about his impending death, how he was resigned to his fate only to have his new wife remind him of his former kids and maybe one of them will donate. And he got excited because he had forgotten all about us and it was as if his hope was renewed. Do you know how annoying it is to listen to the person who is responsible for your very existence talk about forgetting your very existence? Like I was a pair of sturdy old boots that gathered dust in the back of the hall closet. Now, rediscovered, I was to be warned to go shovel dirt. I knew then I wasn't going to give him anything. I'm not worried about a will or being left with anything. He had nothing to leave. He's the male equivalent of a gold digger. He only marries women who can take care of and support him as he mooches off of them. He stole thousands from my mother, and she didn't press charges because she didn't want our children's father in jail. My father was his first wife, and he learned his lesson not to have kids of his own, but to move into ready-made families. His ex-wives and their children have nothing nice to say about him. When I told him I wasn't going through with it, he understood exactly why. He nodded his head in understanding. I already was approached for money to contribute to the funeral, and I will. I gotta say, this story would make good reality TV. I mean, the dad's vanishing act seemed like it was straight out of a Houdini playbook. He vanishes into a puff of smoke, and instead of rabbits, he made child support disappear. And let's not forget the siphoning of cash from mom's ATM. Bravo, Dad. You have definitely set the bar high for terrible parenting decisions. And if these weren't bad enough, this dude went through years of daddy disappointments. Sure, mom was always there, giving her unwavering support to this dude, but did she really handle it correctly? It's one thing to be nice, but to always just let things slide, she has actually become a doormat. No wonder the dad just kept doing whatever he did, from missed visitations to full-blown verbal to the mom, because he always got away with it. And no, the mom wasn't handling things with grace, she was actually enabling him. Maybe if she grew a backbone and had fought back, things would have been different. So years later, the dad reappears, and not for a tearful reunion, mind you. It's for a life-saving favor because all of a sudden he remembers he has a long-lost family that maybe could donate a spare part. So our dude decides to act on his nuclear revenge plan and pretends to be the hero who will save the day, only to play the ultimate trump card and back out of the surgery. Okay, that may be harsh, especially since we're talking about life and death situations, but honestly, who can blame the guy? After years of being abandoned and verbally and emotionally, it would be difficult to summon a feeling of sympathy when they are suddenly needed. So kudos to this dude's courage in standing his ground and refusing to be the pair of forgotten socks at the back drawer. Story 3. This isn't my story, but it comes from my dad and other family members who witnessed it. A little background. This all went down in the late 1970s when my dad was 17. The area he grew up in was in the UK and was a stereotypical working-class town. The part of town where my dad's family lived was run down, full of poor families, and had its fair share of crime, but it was close-knit and everyone knew everyone. Now, my dad wasn't the most well-behaved kid and he hated being at school, but aside from a speeding ticket, he had never been in trouble with the police. He was and still is a really talented musician and had a very active social life. For his 17th birthday, one of his friends had bought him a leather jacket with a very specific logo on it. We'll call this friend Dave for future reference. According to my dad, it was a rare and quite expensive motorcycle jacket, and he was extremely happy that Dave had got it for him. Dave had bought himself the same jacket a while before, and it was a big surprise. My grandmother apparently joked that with the jackets on, they looked like twins, and she wasn't far wrong. They had similar features, black hair, and were both well known for being kitted out in motorcycle gear. A few days after my dad's birthday, he was leaving from work as a bartender in the town center at around 10 p.m. As he was getting close to where his bike was parked, a gang of 5 men approached him from behind. The last thing my dad remembered was being smacked over the head and passing out as he hit the floor. Luckily, 2 bouncers from a nearby pub had heard the commotion and rushed to help. The men ran off, the bouncers called the cops, and my dad was taken to the hospital. It turned out that Dave had quite a substantial wagering habit and owed a large amount of money to people who you really don't want to owe money to. They had threatened Dave and told him that he would be looking for him to teach a lesson. So Dave decided to set up my dad to take the beating instead of himself, or at least lessen his chances of taking it. He had bought my dad the same jacket because these guys knew that was what he wore when he rode. He then arranged for a guy he knew to find out when my dad left work and call up the loan sharks to let them know where Dave was. What a dirtbag. The revenge. My grandfather and grandmother were obviously distraught about this whole thing. The first thought on my grandfather's mind was if my dad would survive. When that was answered, his second thought was how best to get revenge. A bit of background on my grandfather. He was a lifelong boxer and a career military man. He enlisted at the back end of World War II at 17, stayed in the forces through Korea, and then served in Malaysia and Burma as a scout and sniper during the mid to late 1950s. He only reluctantly retired when my dad was little and worked as an engineer after his discharge. This guy is a certified baddie even into his 50s, and although he wasn't the best husband or father at times, he could never stand by and watch his family get hurt. The first move my grandfather made was to call up every ex-service buddy, bouncer, pub landlord, etc., and even a few less than legit characters he knew from the pubs. In my town, word travels fast, and my grandfather was well-liked and had a bit of reputation, so it wasn't long before he had the names and addresses of the 5 men who had attacked my dad. These guys were career criminals with violent reputation, but my grandfather really didn't care who or what they were. My grandfather then called up a few of the most dangerous, hardened guys he knew from the service. He explained to them what had happened, and they were all happy to help. One night, the group kicked in the doors of each thug and beat them to a pulp, all 5 of them. They knew that if they hit one, the others would hear about it and run, so they hit all 5 of them in one night. My grandfather knew that no one would call the police in the area they lived in. Talking to the cops was a big no-no in that area back then, so there was little chance of being caught. All 5 guys ended up with the requirement to be fed from a tube by the end of the night. One of them had to be put into a medically induced coma. Of course, the police interviewed all of them in the hospital when they sufficiently recovered, but none of them talked, both out of fear of my grandfather and fear they would be labeled as rats, and nothing came of it. But my grandfather wasn't done there. My grandfather used his connections in the clubs and bars to start spreading rumors about why they had been beaten up. Soon it had gotten around that these 5 guys had messed up the wrong person. Not only that, but they had bragged about it and lied to whoever they worked for about it. Not only were they physically broken, but my grandfather ruined their credibility so that when they got out, no one, criminal or otherwise, wanted to be associated with them. Once this was all done, my grandfather turned his attention to Dave. He had specifically left Dave for last, knowing that he would be petrified knowing that my grandfather knew what he had done. My grandfather, however, was much more subtle in dealing with Dave, as he thought that a simple beating would be too good for him. He waited and asked around, and it turned out that Dave did not only have a nasty habit, but also had recently turned into a PPA as well. My grandfather found out who he was buying his stuff from when he would usually buy and where. He had a buddy of his follow Dave when he went to buy his stuff, follow him to where he lived, and let my grandfather know. My grandfather then called in an anonymous tip that there was a huge, sorry, deal going on at the address, and he thought he heard gunshots. He got 2 of his buddies to do the same. The police investigated, searched the house, and caught Dave red-handed with boatloads of illegal substances in his home, as well as counterfeit bills and a ton of other illegal stuff. Dave was charged, denied bail, and ended up pleading guilty to all the charges laid against him. My dad could never remember his exact sentence, but it was definitely heavy, at least 15 years. To add to that, Dave owed a lot of money to a lot of people, and let's just say his time in prison was made much worse by this fact. My dad never spoke to him again, his parents disowned him, his girlfriend dumped him, he struggled to get a job with his record, and when he did get out, he had to move miles away as no one he knew wanted anything to do with him. My dad eventually recovered from his injuries, although you can still see various scars on his body. My grandfather never told anyone what he had done until my dad asked him about it when he really got ill in the early 1990s. Dave's life was ruined, and out of the 5 who attacked my dad, 3 ended up in prison later in life, and 2 ended up dead due to crime. My grandfather passed away in the late 1990s, and although my dad and him had their issues, it could never be said he didn't look out for him when he needed it. Wow, this guy was super lucky to have a superhero for a grandpa. I mean, who needs Justice League when this dude's grandpa has his own team of ready to fight off supervillains? I think grandpa would fit the role of Batman perfectly. He is strong and skilled. Sure, he didn't get his hands dirty, but he used his brains to play detective and find out what happened and then came up with strategies to find the baddies. Of course, let's not forget that he may have funded the whole operation, just like Bruce Wayne. Well, he may not be muddied up like Batman, but I can bet he found a way. Too bad for the villain of the story and the mastermind of betrayal, Dave. With people like him, who needs friends, right? I mean, seriously, who does that? So, guys, please, there is a good reason why those substances are illegal. Sure, it could give you a different kind of feeling. You forget your problems, you feel stronger, braver even. But those are just temporary. What it'll do is destroy your life and make you come up with schemes that are, let's face it, just plain stupid. Anyway, all's well that ends well. This dude's dad heals, those hooligans got their behinds kicked, and Dave, the architect of that whole fiasco, got his karma payback. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you made it this far, I'm sure you'll also enjoy I got back at my childhood bullies by destroying an entire town. Reddit podcast story 6 is pretty inspiring. See you in that video.